All right, welcome to the first chapter, a quick introduction to biology. So biology is the study of life. Bios means life, logy means study. So we have similar terms. For example, microbiology, that's the study of microbes, tiny little organisms that we can't really see with the naked eyes, right? We usually use some kind of tool like a microscope to be able to see them. Ecology, study of ecosystems. Zoology, study of animals. So how do we define life since we want to study life? Now, all living organisms have some key characteristics, and we're going to just go through each characteristic real quick. First one is order. So organisms are actually highly organized. It doesn't matter whether they're a unicellular organism consisting of one cell or multicellular organisms consisting of multiple cells. And for example, humans, we can have trillions of cells. So all those cells, they're comprised of atoms and molecules and the cellular structures and cells. And then for multicellular organisms, all those cells are really specialized to perform different functions. And these cells can come together to form organs, like your heart, your brain, that's organs. Organs form different organ systems, cardiovascular system, reproductive system, right? And then you have a whole individual, right? So each of us, we have a functional body, right? That's the individual. So it's really highly organized. The second characteristic is sensitivity. So I have a picture of plants here, and we all know that plants love sunlight, right? So plants can bend toward a source of light so that they can obtain sunlight to perform photosynthesis. Some of the plants we know that can respond to touch too. I don't know if you have seen a Venus flytrap, right? If you just gently tap the leaves, you can see the leaves move and close, and this is how they trap their prey. It's really amazing. So if you haven't seen that, I suggest you can find some videos online. It's very interesting. All right, next characteristic is reproduction. So you're all familiar with that. This is how we create a new life, right? So throughout the semester, you will learn that we have two main types of reproduction: asexual reproduction. For example, this is how bacteria cells can multiply. And sexual reproduction. So this involves gametes, right? What are gametes? They're sex cells, sperm cells or eggs, right? So when a sperm cell fertilizes in an egg, that becomes a zygote, and the zygote will develop into an embryo, right? So the offspring will have new combinations of traits, right? Because you inherit the genetic material from two parents. So a lot of times this will give you some advantages, right? Because you have those kind of new combination of characteristics that may allow you to live better in the environment. Growth and development. We all grow, we all develop, right? So think about how big you were when you were born and how big you are now, right? You probably have grown quite a bit. So the genetic materials provide the introductions for all the organisms to kind of follow, right? The genes tell the organism, tell the body how to grow and develop. Next one, regulation. So organisms, you have to have regulatory mechanisms to coordinate internal functions or to cope with environmental stresses. So for example, in this picture, you see this dog panting. And when do dogs pant? That's when it's too hot, right? So this is their way to deal with this environmental stress. So this is their mechanism of regulating their body temperature, right, according to the changes in the environment. I also mentioned internal functions. So the internal environment also fluctuates quite a bit. So you probably don't realize this, but think about your body temperature, your water content, concentrations of electrolytes in your blood, right? Sodium ions, chloride ions, potassium ions, they all change, they don't stay constant. So you want to kind of maintain them within a very narrow range. That's the normal range. So you don't want them to, change too much. That could make you sick. Right? So you have all these regulatory mechanisms to kind of keep things in check. And this brings us to the next property, homeostasis. So this is really kind of the end result, the outcome of regulation. So homeostasis means your body remains in a stable condition, right, for each specific parameter you're looking at. So again, for example, water content, right? Body temperature, blood sugar level, right? So your body usually, if it functions normally, it stays in these kind of steady, stable condition called homeostasis. Energy processing. So all organisms use a source of energy, right? This is how we survive. This is how we perform metabolism. So we can actually classify organisms based on how they get energy. So we have producers. Producers are also known as autotrophs, meaning they can feed themselves. They can make their own food from nutrients and non-living sources. For example, sunlight. A lot of producers or autotrophs can also use minerals from the environment to provide energy for their survival. We also have consumers. Consumers are also known as heterotrophs because they have to eat, they have to feed on something else, right? So they get energy by consuming other organisms. Decomposers, these are also heterotrophs, but they tend to get their energy from dead organisms. So that's why we call them decomposers, or some kind of waste, right? Like a pile of dog poop, that's waste, and decomposers can break that down, right? And then extract energy from the waste. So all the organisms can live together in the ecosystem and they can form, normally it's a food web, but in this example, I have a food chain. Let me just go back real quick. So trees, grass, they can photosynthesize, make their own food. So they're producers. Lions, us humans, bears, fish, we're all consumers because we have to feed on something else. Mushroom, fungi, bacteria, and some of the little kind of insects, some of the bugs, they can also decompose. So they're decomposers. So this is a typical food chain, right? From the material, the nutrients, and the energy flow from producers, right, to consumers. And based on their food, we can further divide them to primary consumer. That's at the lowest level. They're going to be eaten by something else. So for instance, it's a secondary consumer, right? And then the tertiary consumer, that's at the highest level of the food chain. And then when all these things die, whether it's producer or consumer, their body will be decomposed by decomposer. And then the nutrients, mostly in the form of inorganic materials, will be returned back to the environment, and then they can be recycled and used by other organisms. So that's the cycle, almost kind of, the cycle of life, right? This is actually not my initial list, but I kind of want to add it because this is related to our last, second to last chapter, evolution. So organisms can adapt to the environment, and that's why they existed in the environment, right? Because they have those characteristics that allow them to survive and to reproduce in the environment. So adaptation is where the organisms inherit traits that make them better suited to the environment. So it's they have better survival and they have more successful reproduction. So you probably know a little bit about natural selection. So through adaptation, a set of traits that make one organism more successful than another. So through natural selection, the organisms that have higher fitness can survive better. And this is really the driving force of evolution, right? From the evolution of, or the creation, the formation of new species based on or from the old species. So because the environment changes constantly, so this drives species to form new characteristics, and then they become new species. So this is just kind of tells you that matter is most basically made of atoms. So atoms are the fundamental unit of matter with unique chemical properties. So for example, hydrogen atom, oxygen atom, and the atoms can form molecules. So here we have a water molecule, H2O, that consists of 3 atoms, right? 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. We also have groups of macromolecules. So macro means big. So these molecules are typically really big. A lot of times they have very long chains. So for example, in this picture, we have a DNA. DNA is a type of nucleic acid. So nucleic acids are macromolecules. And you know that DNA can have a very, very long chain structure, right? So organelles can together create a cell, and then we know cells, this can form an individual organism. So this is the organization of life, just kind of quick review of what we just discovered. So starting from atom, we move on to molecule, okay? And then we can form cell organelles and the cell. And when you have a group of cells with the same characteristics, functions, that forms tissue. With multiple tissues, you can have organ, right? Like a heart is an organ, brain is an organ. They usually consist of multiple tissues. And then we have organ systems. I mentioned earlier, like your cardiovascular system, that's made of your heart, right? And then your blood vessels. Next level organisms, so that's individuals. So you and me, we are individual organisms. Population, this is on a kind of larger scale now. So when you have a group of individuals from the same species living in the same place and time, that's a population. So for example, we can talk about the wolf population living in Yellowstone, right? So that's a population, consists of individuals from the same species. Community does not include the non-living physical environment, but it does include all the living species, all the species that interact with each other. So in this picture, what is the community? You have trees, right? You have a grass, you have elephants, you have microbes that you can't really see in the picture, right? So they all interact with each other, so they form a community. And then when you throw in the non-living physical environment, that's an ecosystem. So it consists of both the living component, right, and then the non-living component. And when you have all the ecosystems together on this planet, that forms a biosphere. So we're gonna move on to cells. So we're gonna just talk about real quick some of the features of cells. All the cells should have these four structures: plasma membrane that really kind of define the boundary of the cell, separates the inside from the outside. Cytoplasm, so that's the kind of semi-fluid, kind of sticky substance in the cell, right? It composes like most of the cell. It provides like a volume. DNA, all cells have genetic material, and that's DNA. All cells should have ribosomes, and we'll talk about why that's the case when we get to cellular structures. So ribosomes are involved in protein synthesis, and all cells need proteins, so we need ribosomes. So this is a quick comparison between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells are normally a lot smaller than eukaryotic cells. Examples are bacteria cells. And you know, bacteria, they're very small, right? They're tiny. And eukaryotic cells, like our cells, are a lot bigger. Some of the key differences. First is that this is probably the most important one. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, right? You can see this spherical structure almost in a eukaryotic cell. So that's a nucleus. And the genetic material is enclosed. DNA is enclosed in the nucleus. But in prokaryotic cells, the DNA is not, separated by anything. It's just kind of flowing freely in the cytoplasm. But there is an area where they tend to aggregate. So we call that nucleoid. Nucleoid is not a true nucleus. It's just the region where you can find the DNA. And the second key difference is prokaryotic cells, because they're a lot simpler. Right? They don't have a membrane-bound organelles, so they don't have Golgi apparatus. They do not have vesicles. They do not have mitochondria. But you can find all those cells in a eukaryotic cell. Okay, so those are the two key differences between the two cells. In addition to size difference. who are just some typical characteristics of prokaryotic cells. A lot of the cells have cell walls, and in fact, some of the antibiotics, they actually target the cell wall of bacteria cells. So this is how they can kill bacteria. And some cells have flagella or pili, so this involves in motion, movement, or exchange of genetic material. Biodiversity. So this just refers to all species on this planet, the variety of life and its processes, how they interact with each other, how they perform their own functions, how they contribute to the integrity, right, the entire ecosystem. We all know that we're losing biodiversity, right? So that's actually a really critical issue right now. Phylogenetic tree, which is shown here, two forms of a phylogenetic tree, a rooted one and an unrooted one. So the purpose for making a phylogenetic tree is really just to show the relationship between different species, and specifically evolutionary relationship between different species. So which two species are more closely related to each other, which species did they evolve from, right? Things like that. So this phylogenetic tree, this is the most common one, a rooted one. So this is the root. It kind of indicates that all these organisms have common ancestry, and then they diverge, right, to different groups. So we're going to focus on three main domains. So this is first domain, that's bacteria. The second domain, archaea. So archaea are also bacteria, but they're kind of a little bit different than this group of bacteria. So we put them in a separate domain. And then the third domain, that's where we are actually. So this includes most of the animals that you are familiar with. Not just animals, but the organisms you're familiar with. So all plants, all animals, and there's some other organisms. They're all in this group. Okay, so we're gonna kind of focus on each domain just real quick. Bacteria, they do not have a nucleus. So nuclei is the plural of nucleus. So if that's the case, you know what they are, right? So they're prokaryotic organisms. And they are unicellular, meaning the whole organism consists of just one cell. There are beneficial bacteria, but look at it from the viewpoint of humans, the perspective of humans, beneficial bacteria, they live inside our body or our body surface, but they do kind of help us maintain maintain our health because they compete with the bad bacteria, or they can help us break down certain material like fibers. So they can be good to us, but we also have some pathogenic bacteria, right? Those bacteria will make us sick. But keep in mind, most of the bacteria, they are not the bad bacteria. A lot of bacteria don't care about us at all. They're not going to make us sick. They don't feed on us, right? They have their own food source. So most of the bacteria are harmless. The second group, domain archaea, so these are often known as ancient bacteria. We haven't found any bacteria from this domain that can make us sick. Okay, so remember that. So this group is pretty good. Now they like to live in sometimes a very extreme environment. So you can see this is a hot spring, right? The temperature is really high, but the bacteria from this domain archaea, they can live in there. They can also live in environment where not friendly to other organisms. So you can see in this picture, the water probably has a lot of sulfur, but archaea can survive. Last domain, eukarya, so protista. These can be unicellular or multicellular. In this picture, this is a amoeba, so it is unicellular. There's only one cell. Now some of these organisms can make us sick. I don't know if you guys have heard of what happened at the wet water center a few years back. A teenager got infected by the kind of scary name brain-eating amoeba, right? So eventually she died because of the infection. So some of the organisms from this group can make us sick. Animalia, so all animals, all plants, or fungi, right? So these are the typical species in domain Eukarya. So this is just different branches of biology. You probably have a field that you're really interested in. So I would like to hear some of your thoughts on these different fields of biology.